Second presentation is by Rosa Abraham. She is currently assistant professor at Azim Premji University. Her research focuses on informal work and women's employment with a particular interest in issues at the intersection of labor statistics and women's work. At the Center for Sustainable Employment, she has been involved in the State of Working India reports and in two primary surveys, India Working Survey and the COVID-19 Livelihood Survey, conducted by the Center. Rosa, you will have 20 minutes as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present this work. So this is with my co-authors Rahul Lahoti, who's at UNU Wider, and Hema Swaminathan, who's here and will be joining us in the panel later on. So in this paper, basically what we're looking at is the events of marriage and motherhood, and what does that mean for women's employment. Some of this has been discussed a lot in the morning sessions, and this might be slightly contradictory or provoking results, but I hope it starts a good conversation. Okay. So, I don't think I'm going to spend too much time on the context. So, as you know, labor force participation of women in India is exceptionally low, especially in comparison with similar countries across the world. And there's been several reasons that has been discussed. So, on the one hand, you have these sort of supply side issues, which include social norms, and there's been multiple papers, this is not exhaustive, which discuss this. There's also the income effect, which is also partly the supply side answer as well. And then there's been also, as we heard today morning, these demand side factors as well, which talks about how the nature of structural change has been such that it has not really been able to keep women in the labor force as well as allow women to enter into the labor force as well. And there's also now increasing attention to issues around measurement, which talks about both how the conceptualization of employment misses activities that women are crucially engaged in, and at the same time the operationalization of a lot of labor surveys in terms of who's asked and what is asked and how is it being asked also can potentially miss out a lot of women who are in employment. And then another reason that has also been discussed is the sort of life cycle dynamics, which is that women have these life events that have crucial implications for their employment outcomes. And so this paper that I'm presenting today deals specifically with these life cycle dynamics. So the life cycle events that we talk about are marriage and childbirth. So what do we know happens to women's employment upon marriage? Not much really. So in the high-income country context, we all know that marriage norms are relatively relaxed, and so in that sense, the expectation that marriage as an event would have huge implications for employment is not really there, and so there's limited research around that. And there's been a paper by Baniel and all who look at this marriage as an event and find that it is a negligible impact, as you would expect. In low-income countries, a lot of these studies on life cycle event impacts is limited because of a lack of panel data. And often cross-sectional comparison of married and unmarried women, it is useful to understand these differences between these two categories of women. It limits us in our understanding of what exactly is the causal impact of that event on its own. So this is just this is from the PLFS comparing the employment rates over age of married and single women. And as you can see, at levels, as you would expect, married women are less likely to be employed all throughout their lifetime, and the levels are much higher for single women. But what you can't really conclusively say from this is it that the event of marriage that is what is pulling women's labor force participation down, because it could just be that these two samples of women are intrinsically very different, and in that sense, can we really compare these two? So another way, and I'm taking a little bit of a detour here, is also to, since you don't really have this long series panel, you could also construct what could be called a pseudo panel, which, so this is a work that I'm doing looking at constructing cohorts using the PLFS employment unemployment surveys. So the logic behind this is that you track a group of young cohorts. So you're 18 to 24-year-olds in the 1983 employment survey, who by the time 5 years later when you go and interview the same, it's not the same households, but the same sample, these group of men or women would have been in the age group of 23 to 29. And so on, you can track this cohort or this generation all the way from when they are 18 to 24 till more recently from when they are 53 to 59. So that's about 30 years of their lifetime of the cohort that you can track. So you can construct similar cohorts. So in this case, I have 4 cohorts. And for the first cohort, I can get up to 35 years of their life cycle. For the later cohort, about 15 years of their life cycle. Now, the expectation is when you track these women over their life cycle, for women, the expectation is that it's an M-shaped curve, that as they age, there is one dip in their employment which is observed at the time of marriage and childbirth, and then that picks up again, and then it falls as they age. But this is what we see in the case of India, and I want to draw your attention specifically to the red line, which is the first cohort. So the first cohort is the earliest cohort. That's the folks for whom we have information for 35 years. And you can see that there's no M shape here. They enter, then there's a peak at around the time when they're 40 years old, and then there's a fall in employment rate. And now I want to draw your attention to the green line, which is the most recent generation of women workers who are entering later, but also you can see that the employment rates are in general at levels lower than their earlier or their grandparents' generation. So in general, amongst the new generation of women, you find that they are less likely to be employed compared to earlier generations of women. Interestingly, you see some peak. You don't see the dip that you see in the other cohorts, but then there's limited data. I mean, once we have more data for later years, I'll be able to extend that cohort. But the point I'm trying to make with both of these kind of approaches is that you don't see, when you do these kind of try and capture life cycle patterns over time, you don't see the expected fall post around the time of marriage or around the time of childbirth even. Right. So when it comes to motherhood, in the high-income country context, it's fairly established, conclusive and consistent evidence that post-childbirth, there's a motherhood penalty. And how that motherhood penalty, as you can see, the 2 lines that dip all to the bottom is basically the women's employment rate for Denmark and Sweden. And on the top 2 lines are for men. So men don't really face a penalty post-childbirth. But for women, there's a fall in their earnings, and this is persistent. They continue to earn lower than what they did prior to childbirth. This is in the high-income country context. In more recent years, there's this paper by Aguera, which looks at this similar penalty, and this in this case is employment penalty, for 21 low and middle-income countries. And what they find is that, so as the income of the country increases, you find that there is a likelihood to be a penalty, which is a fall in employment rate. But what you can see, for example, in the case of Mozambique and Nepal, that post-motherhood, there is actually a small increase in women's employment rate. And you can see several other countries who are sort of having positive penalty in a sense that seems to suggest that either women's employment is increasing or there seems to be no discernible impact on employment post-childbirth. In a most recent context, this is paper by Chile by Berniel et al., where they find that, yes, there's a penalty in terms of employment, as you can see from the green line, which is mother's employment rate. So the event is, the vertical line, and post the event, there's a decline in their employment. You don't see any significant effect for men. But what Berniel et al. Find is that the decline is actually led largely by a decline in formal jobs. So your regular salaried work, that is what is driving the decline in women's employment rate. On the other hand, you find that informal jobs, which is your casual and self-employment, declines initially, but then it increases, and you find that by about 5 or 6 years after childbirth, there's really no discernible impact in terms of women's informal employment compared to their employment pre-childbirth. Now, what do we have in the Indian context? So as I said, there is huge limitations in terms of this kind of data that we have. So we have some cross-sectional data which does this kind of comparison and finds that the presence of a child in the household seems to bring down women's employment. But again, this doesn't allow us to make a sort of a causal statement. we have new evidence. There's panel data again, which is only for 2 time periods, which doesn't tell us much. There's a more recent paper by Ashwini, who she presented it today, but one part of that paper, what also looks at is finds that there's no significant change in labor force participation for women around motherhood. It actually is increasing before motherhood. There is some decline a year prior to childbirth, but not around the event of childbirth as such. So in this context, what we are trying to look at is how do these major life events, marriage and motherhood, affect women's labor market participation. But, it's kind of like the Bernal paper, we want to also look at what is the nature of women's labor force participation, beyond just the employment binary. And then pause to then also reflect on this notion of a motherhood penalty and how it really applies in the Indian context. So this, the data for this study comes from the India Working, okay, I'm going to speed up. So the India Working Survey is a 2-state survey which we conducted in Feb and March of 2020. It had to be prematurely terminated because of COVID, but the sample that we have is about 6,000 individuals, and it's a primarily rural sample in these 2 states. And and what we use is this technique called the life history calendar. So the life history calendar it's a paper-based survey technique, and it allows us to collect retrospective data. Basically, and I'll show you what the survey looks like, the instrument looks like. You can see these columns on the right-hand side. Essentially, each column pertains to a particular year for in that person's lifetime. So suppose we meet a 35-year-old woman. We collect her employment information as well as other information from when she was 15 years old till her current age. So we have information on when childbirth occurred, when marriage occurred, when she finished her education, as well as we have information on whether she was employed or not, and if she was employed, the kind of employment she was in. So it could be self-employed, informal casual work, or formal salaried work as well. So we have essentially information on people from when they were 18 years old all the way till their current age and the events around that, between that lifetime. Now we use this data to then construct an event study, to apply an event study model, where we then essentially look at the outcome, which is whether they're employed or not, as well as the nature of employment, and with these controls for event, age, and year dummies. And we also have some robustness checks around this, but I'm not going to spend time discussing that. So just a simple, what does our sample look like? Marriage and childbirth is near universal event. So most men and women are married, and most definitely if they are married, almost all of them have at least one child. Women tend to marry earlier, so they marry at age 18, and within 2 years they have their first child. And men marry slightly later, and then again there's a 2-year gap between marriage and fatherhood. So this is our first result, which is basically the event study model and the interpretation. So you can see the horizontal line is the time of occurrence of the event of marriage. And you can see the line to the left of that is the, you can find that it's not significantly different. The employment is not significantly, there's no significant difference between participation pre-marriage and at the time of the event of marriage. But post-marriage, as you can see for women, you can see that there's a jump, which is basically that post-marriage there's almost a 35% increase in women's employment, and that seems to continue for the next 5 years. For men, compared to their pre-marriage employment rate, there's no discernible impact. So marriage as an event doesn't really affect men's employment significantly, whereas for women, we are finding that there is a sustained increase in their employment post-marriage. What is the kind of employment that increases post-marriage? So we basically divided the kind of employment into paid employment and your contributing family worker. So contributing family worker is your unpaid worker who helps in the family farm or business, is not explicitly paid for it, but shares in the profits from that. And you can see that there is, again, a very high increase in women's paid employment, and there is also some increase in contributing family work. And within paid employment, what we find is that most of this employment is informal employment. So it's not your regular salaried work that increases, it's informal employment that increases post-marriage, and most of this informal employment is casual wage work, and to some extent self-employment as well. So And then what we then find is now we do a similar analysis where we use now childbirth as our event of interest. What you find is that post-childbirth again, you find that there is an increase. There's no decrease as you would as the grander narrative would suggest. There is actually a slight increase, but I must point out that at this point there's no parallel trends that you would need from an event study, but that's because pre-childbirth and you have marriage and there's already an increase that happens post-marriage. Now, post-childbirth, and the point to be made is that there's no decline post-childbirth, and in fact the increase that you see post-marriage continues to persist even after childbirth. And this increase is again largely in paid employment and not in salaried work, but rather in their self-employment and casual wage work. We do some heterogeneity, and what we are finding is that a lot of this increase, so we do this for specified samples, and we find that this increase is largely for women from poorer households as well as from women who are in general category, the upper castes, and we also find that the increase is higher in the case of women whose mothers were employed. So we have some generational information as well. I'm not going to spend time on the robustness checks, but I want to just, before I kind of bring this all together, just highlight that this is retrospective data, so there is a possibility of recall bias. We only have information on the extensive margin, so we have information on employed or not as well as the type of employment. What we don't have is information on hours worked or earnings and so on. And like I noted, there is some pre-trends in the case of childbirth, but the broader findings that there is no decline post-childbirth remains. So what do we kind of say? Is that there is a large increase in labor force participation post-marriage, and the penalty that is typically expected is not seen post-childbirth. And I'm just going to go, sorry. So one thing to note is that pre-marriage, women's labor force participation is already very low. So you have a base effect, and it's only likely to just go up from there. You've already hit rock bottom in a sense. But it is also likely that post-marriage, there is a change in norms. So the notions of purity and having to kind of remain within the confines of the home may be relaxed slightly post-marriage. And in many households, particularly in rural India, employment is a necessity and not really a choice. So in that sense, care work for children is in a sense luxury good for many households. And so when there's a highly informal labor market, what does that mean is that the informal labor market allows women to engage in market work alongside childcare. So especially in rural areas, in the context of agricultural households, there's these work by Leela Gautam and all, who find that it allows for women to have a temporal flexibility, so they can engage in their informal work in an intermittent timings. They can also have decide the number of hours that they want to do that work. And this kind of informal work also affords them spatial flexibility, because they can often stay within the home and they're not expected to go to a workplace in a sense. It could also be that the expansion of Narega has also meant that a lot of women kind of access casual wage work, again informal work, and this continues even after childbirth. And there's also evidence that find that informal workers are more likely to return to work after childbirth. They have shorter durations of breastfeeding as well as maternal care post-childbirth. And so it's not sort of contradictory in terms of lived experiences of many women. So I think this also then we need to kind of reflect and come back to ideas of measurement of women's work and the idea of employment as a good in its own. Because implicit in the notion of a motherhood penalty is the idea that work or employment is good, and when you are withdrawing from work, then you're incurring a penalty. But then this is not to say that the absence of the penalty is indicative of a favorable outcome. But really what's happening is that women are not incurring a penalty, but they're continuing to have to engage in manual, informal, precarious work at the same time while also having to balance their role of social reproduction alongside this productive work that they do. Thank you.